We're back talking very different visions of immigration reform. If you want it as different as it comes, you can always turn to Rand Paul. Here on The Run, that means turning, smile at the ready, to panelist Todd Seavey. Todd, a generation or two after Rand Paul, as is inevitable, becomes president, what does America look like?
I think odds are a generation after he becomes president, we're all exterminated by out-of-control military robots, but we'll leave that issue for another day.
From above.
And I think regardless of who becomes president, probably one generation from now, America is just barely like a white European descended majority, and then the plurality of the rest of the population is Hispanic. So I don't know, it makes that huge difference. But long story short, to my delight, he has ended up with a fairly mainstream Republican view, which I think means not anti-immigration as some of the most hardcore right-wing activists are, but more find some legal status for the people who are already here, but not necessarily citizenship. So
close to Jeb Bush?
Something like 11 million guest worker visas, that sort of thing, which is a relief to me because I have to admit, the thing I was most worried I would disagree with him on, and which there's some internal division amongst libertarians on, is immigration. His father started out, not so much his last presidential run, but his father started out basically of the view that national sovereignty is the most important thing. So he was wary of tendencies toward global governance, and as long as he was attacking global government, that's fine, but it also meant a certain paranoia about influence even by foreign companies or immigration, which I think true libertarians should see as acceptable things. And so I was wondering how much of that his son would pick up, especially since if his son wanted to, he could probably tap into the really hardcore anti-immigration resentment on the right, but he seems to have chosen not to, which is a good thing. Let Ted Cruz try to appeal to those people. And lose. So I think Rand Paul will have a relatively moderate position, and it's nice that he's pretty much the only major candidate in favor of ending the drug war, because if one of the biggest concerns is that letting in Mexicans means letting in drug gangs, ending the drug war is the best way to solve that problem, because then you get your drugs from Pfizer or whoever, or CVS, instead of having to rely upon cartels to traffic drugs north and south. So if you want to end that violence, end the drug war, and then a lot of the scary factors go away. Except, of course, for the people who are frightened of a competition for low-wage jobs. And interestingly, if I can just briefly mention another candidate, Scott Walker did a somewhat troubling about-face in that he sounded fairly sympathetic to immigration, and then started sounding more not just anti-illegal immigration, but anti-legal immigration. And I blame the left in some ways, in that, I mean, obviously he's on the right, but he started using the sort of labor protectionist arguments we sometimes hear on the left, like, oh, we can't have new people come in and compete for those fragile, low-wage jobs. And this is also one
the union mentality.
Exactly, and it's
which
one
is
of
not all left, by the way. There's a lot of Republicans in unions.
And it's sort of a Pat Buchanan mentality as well. Like, we must protect ourselves from both foreign people and foreign economics.
It's good for me, but not for them.
And one interesting footnote to this is it's also served as a reminder of what a beneficial impact the Koch brothers have on American politics, because they sort of did an about-face. It sounded like they were leaning toward, or at least one of them, David Koch, was leaning toward almost endorsing Walker, but almost the same day, Walker happened to start talking about this labor protectionist type of view of immigration. And suddenly, David Koch backed off a little and said, "Whoa, we're not making any endorsements yet," which increases the odds that maybe they'll go with Rand Paul, an actual libertarian or close to it.
And lose the general.
Instead of the fickle Scott Walker, who talks like a right-winger one day and some kind of socialist labor protectionist the next. He's too much of a left-wing hippie for me.
Anders, what were you thinking?
I mean, I don't think you're going to win the general election with a strong libertarian argument. I think
Hillary Clinton is halfway there. She thinks she can win that way.
Well, I think she's taking a centrist and also future, very concerned about the future direction of the Democratic Party. And I think that's a very smart move. for her and for the Democrats. But I think what's interesting to me about Rand Paul and his positions is that he's so much more concerned with being electable than his dad was. Is that correct?
I think that's fair,
And
that's
we're seeing that in the immigration debate as well.
and that's one of the reasons why some of his father's fans don't like Rand Paul. They think like, oh, he's too squishy. I mean, I think on all the positions that matter, they are virtually identical. But to some of the libertarians, the most important thing is that you're putting a thumb in the eye of the regular political process. So if his father seemed like he was willing to say, I don't care if they elect me, and the son sounds like, no, I can win this. Then
But Rand Paul will push to make it easier for people who are here illegally and those who are not yet here at all to become citizens, or
no,
to have
not
a path to
necessarily.
legal status.
I think he, like the other Republicans, is avoiding saying path to citizenship. So that's the way Hillary is trying to differentiate herself. Is basically saying
Because that's the dog whistle on the right. That if we legalize people and give them actual citizenship, they're going to vote and they'll only vote for Democrats.
What's wrong with a second tier? What's wrong with being here legally, being able to work, contribute to the economy, build a better life for yourself, but if you came here illegally, you just don't get to vote?
I think it just depends on how you got here. If we talk about someone who was brought here as a 9-month-old baby or a 5-year-old child, why should they be disenfranchised,
Sure.
right? We also have people on the right who are so, xenophobic that they want to undo the American citizenship right, that if you're born here, you're automatically a citizen. And again, for a certain class of people. The Steve Kings of the world, he's not alone in his ludicrous statement about, what do you say, for every valedictorian, there's 100 drug runners.
Cantaloupes, yes.
Right. It's just insanity, but they are very good at getting a certain, population on the right. And it's not even the far right, middle class white people, slightly older, who believe all this stuff. So I don't know that I agree with Anders that the libertarian argument, just sort of completely open borders, is not going to fly on the right or the left. But
I, for one, would love to see Ted Cruz continually asked about the presidential eligibility and Canada issue.
That's been settled.
It's so postmodern. I would just love to see him haunted by that.
Jonathan.
Melody, we agree on so much. We agree on everything. But Melody did bring up, again, an issue that's a serious one. That these guest worker programs that were tried in Germany and France,
yes,
they've led to a lot of conflict and enmity. And I think there is an issue of fairness. If you're in a country for a long period of time, you can't be equal? What is that?
Actually, I guess it depends on what citizenship means. I mean, if it means eligibility for, say, welfare and other benefits, then in a way,
there is no welfare program. Can we just settle that once and for all? There is no such thing as welfare in this country. You might get a few pennies once a month,
temporary assistance to needy families.
But it's very little. It barely exists anymore. It might be $400 a month.
Do you deny that $400 a month is a lot to
not when they're living here. Not when they're living here.
Well, what if you got Section 8 housing too?
Right, but that's a giveaway to the corporations. We could even, we could have that discussion that Section 8 housing, especially in this city, is a huge giveaway to corporations. So no, I agree that the guest worker program, it's fraught with difficulty. That someone remains a second-class citizen. And I also object to the characterization of, in some ways, surprise you, Todd, I agree with you wholeheartedly on people's ability to go, and follow the jobs and follow the money, that they are here for a better life. And so to then say that we're not going to put bankers in jail for destroying the economy, but we're going to put some poor man in jail who's just trying to feed his kids, that to me is a big problem.
Okay, let's get back to Todd, though. If we do have more open borders generally, true in the past 10, 15, 20 years, immigrants from Latin America have gone to more and more the interior of the United States, not just the border states, but the bulk of the burden of the influx does fall on Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. Is there anything the federal government would need to do and that you would support in a limited government scenario with more open borders from the federal government to those states?
Oh, well, no. I'll also say that if you're a traditionalist, as for example Pat Buchanan, who's sort of paranoid about immigration, ostensibly is, I would think you should recognize that Florida, California, and Texas were historically Spanish-speaking anyway. So really, they're just reclaiming what is traditionally their land. I don't have a big problem with that. I think Pete Wilson, governor of California in the late 90s, oddly enough, stumbled into almost the right idea when he was pushing for a sort of two-tiered system where anybody could come in. He knew there was very little chance of keeping Latinos out of California. That would be a lost battle. But he wanted to say they can't get various government benefits. And the courts later overturned that and basically said, yes, you can. But I think that wouldn't be so bad. In fact, over time, at some point, it would become a weird hereditary looking thing. But if you said citizens are the only people eligible for government benefits, but that keeps shrinking as new people come in until finally citizenship is a handful of old white fogies who are still eligible for welfare, it'd be sort of grotesque and wouldn't look very much like a universalist human rights
Service
standard.
guarantees citizenship.
But it would gradually shrink what government did. It'd be sort of like in the movie Starship Troopers, where the citizens are soldiers and nobody
Service
else
guarantees
is.
citizenship.
Sounds like an
Can I-
oligarchy to me.
Can I say a historical analogy here? There was a country a long time ago that had this citizen army that was composed largely of farmers, that was very powerful, and they wound up conquering all their neighbors and built up a big empire, but they only had a handful of citizens. This was Rome, and as you may recall, their representative form of government ended, and they wound up with an emperor. So I don't think the historical record on that is too good.
Rome, the most diverse society prior to our own.
Based on slavery, too.
A different kind of slavery than we had, a very different kind of slavery.
All right, let's ask this though. Many of the comparisons to immigration in the 20th century, you see much less diversity in terms of race, but much more diversity in terms of language and culture. How important is it that there's been a shift to greater diversity in terms of race, but less diversity in terms of language? Melody.
Well, first
Are
of
we
all,
moving to a truly kind of bipolar culture as opposed to a melting pot?
so first of all, to label people Hispanic, it only means that they come from a country that speaks Spanish. Because Hispanics come in all colors and sizes.
Exactly my
Right.
exactly my
Or
question.
Portuguese,
Yes,
actually.
well, I guess technically. And when we talk about Latina or Latino, which is something that is a self-designation
Yes.
for many of the people of color who are Hispanic.
It's more political.
That it's a different, yeah, it's a political designation. That because if we're talking literally about the future of this country, where Hispanics will become 50% of the population sometime in the next 20 years or so, that if you look at that population, it is as diverse as they come, from the blackest of the black to the whitest of the white. So, and also within the countries that they're coming from, there's tremendous cultural and ethnic diversity, depending upon what their backgrounds are, what their economic status was in
And
the
linguistic
country.
diversity.
And their what?
And linguistic diversity. You've got the
Well, but
Portuguese coming from Brazil. You've got different native languages all throughout Latin America.
Todd, you're the one to speak to this point. How much of what you lament and deplore in right-wingers who oppose immigration reform is really about language rather than race? I think about your favorite friend, Pat Buchanan, who would embrace a Herman Cain, for example, but will not embrace someone crossing the border speaking Spanish.
I think the big fear of the Pat Buchanan type conservatives is really balkanization, and it's easier in a way for a nation to break apart along linguistic lines than along color lines. It seems like people are capable of integrating with people who look different more easily than people who speak differently, which is not that surprising. I mean, because then you just don't necessarily know what the cultural dialogue, don't as easily and as frequently know what the cultural dialogue is amongst the people who are having a different language.
English is becoming a global language.
Yeah,
I don't think
I'm-
we have to worry about balkanization in the United States.
I'm not saying it's
you
it's
know,
a it's a
based
huge.
on Spanish.
I'm not saying it's a huge worry of mine, but I think that's why you'll find the linguistic divisions worrying the Pat Buchanan.
And language
I think
changes
that-
over time, right? So you might have Spanish and English melding into something over hundreds
That's
of years.
right.
How about a compromise? How palatable would the compromise be politically, especially in the general election, to have a much more liberal immigration policy coupled with, for the first time ever, a declaration of English as the national language?
I think that that's a big mistake, declaring English as the national language.
In concert with
I think it
broader
makes no
immigration
sense.
reform.
What's the point? Who cares? I mean, why do we
People who
need
want us
it?
to have a...
Because it's a xenophobic notion. It's why do we need it? It's because white people want to hang on to the Anglo-Saxon culture. It's the only reason that people clamor for English as the
So you
national
would reject
language.
that compromise,
I
that
reject
political
it.
compromise.
In a
It's
world
not
of
a
Google
You would not take
Translate, we
$10
don't
of
need to
taxes
Because
be.
we're talking about
$1
global trade
additional
and
taxes.
globalization. Can we have, understand that multiple languages, just like multiple cultures, makes us stronger and better, and not, closing off any part of our culture. We are who we are because of the most radical mix of people that since the Roman Empire.
Jonathan.
Wait, can I just want to, as someone who is not a whit Anglo-Saxon ancestry, I want to make a defense of Anglo-Saxon culture. Anglo-Saxon culture is the culture from which we take our particular form of representative government and our particular system of laws, which is based on common law.
It actually goes back to Rome.
Yeah,
really. It
Greece
goes back to Rome before.
goes back to
No,
Greece.
but the particular form we have with the bicameral legislature
Well, that's
and
just a
common
specification.
law.
Respect of common law. Yeah.
That's tinkering.
It's very important, and this is something that we should be those of us, and I include pointedly myself, those of us who are not of some Anglo-Saxon ancestry, we should be very grateful for, and I think it's very important and very
The Greek
important
Empire
to know.
was all about embracing diversity.
Well, it wasn't.
Alexander
I mean,
Alexander
Greeks
the
were
Great
no better
was all
at granting
over.
citizenship than
No.
anybody
Alexander
anybody
the Great
else.
was all over. He was promoting
theories out there.
intermarriage of his soldiers with
But
the
they didn't
people
make
he
them
conquered.
citizens.
They weren't.
No,
It wasn't.
no,
It
it was-
wasn't.
it was
They didn't have
citizens.
any representative form of government,
Oh,
from which
it
we
was
benefit
diverse. They
They
tremendously.
did, but they had, the rich white guys were the citizens.
A more
yeah.
a more moderate version of the Pat Buchanan concern, a more pragmatic version, if you will, and something that maybe Jonathan Leaf has witnessed, is that some of the people who are most opposed to making bilingual education official policy in American public schools, for instance, are themselves immigrants who know that if kids are taught in Spanish, they're less likely to economically flourish and merge with the rest of the
It
society.
depends on the subjects, because there's also studies that prove that if kids are allowed to take math and science in their native language first, they will do much better. And when they fail the test because they've had to take them in English, they get relegated to special ed classes and special needs students, and they never ever recover from it, ever.
Well, these are two subjects that's very interesting, but there are two different subjects that happen to become more related as time goes on. The first is how easily do you learn, and clearly you learn most readily in your native tongue. But then secondly, how do you integrate with society? And
But bilingual education has been mischaracterized. No one who supports bilingual education is supporting it for every class and across the board. They are supporting the limited use of testing and instruction in math and science. Especially because these are the areas where we really are falling way behind on a global scale. And if kids who have an aptitude for it, but they're being penalized because they arrive in 3 months later, they're being tested in English and they fail the test, and that's how they get labeled.
So bilingual education is a means to an end, and the end still is integration into the greater society.
Yes,
both
and
economically
fluency in English and being able to, because it drives me nuts when I encounter people on the phone that can't really speak English very well.
Sure
and
drives them nuts too.
Yeah, well, it probably does.
When you don't speak their language.
Right, and I don't. I mean, I can speak a little tiny bit of Spanish and a little tiny bit of French. But no, because we know that English is the language of commerce. So that's got to be an ultimate goal, so that if we're talking about a level playing field and giving kids who come here from anywhere and from any background are able to compete fairly, then they must be able to speak English.
So you support English as sort of the lingua franca, had to say it, in
Yeah.
the United
But
States.
not national, but not as national
But not as a
language.
matter of law. Just
Right, not as a
ma-
matter of law.
In our hearts, not in our laws.
Yes.
Excellent, okay. Radical change. Is Rand Paul alone on that over on the right, or does the left have some cards left to play, even after Hillary's announcement? That's next on The Run.